On July 4, 2021, a restaurant opened in Minneapolis with no beef, no wheat, no dairy. It served only foods that existed on this continent before Europeans arrived. That restaurant grossed $4 million in its first year. This is not a story about ancient history preserved in a museum case. This is a story about a food system that someone tried to erase and failed. The man who built that restaurant grew up on a reservation eating government commodity cheese. The seeds his kitchen uses today survived boarding schools, relocation programs, and a century of federal agriculture policy. His name is Sean Sherman, and he is Oglala Lakota. Every plate on that menu was built around three sisters planting corn, beans, and squash. But before we get to him, go back not to 4,000 years ago. Go back to 1950. Because that is when the machinery of erasure entered its final, most aggressive phase. And understanding what was lost in 1950 is the only way to understand what winning in 2022 actually means. In 1950, the United States government had a problem by its own accounting. There were still hundreds of thousands of Native people living on reservation land, maintaining their own governance, their own food systems, their own cultural continuity. The federal government called this the Indian problem. In 1953, Congress passed House Concurrent Resolution 108, the termination policy. The goal was straightforward: end the legal existence of tribal nations as sovereign entities, relocate tribal members to cities, dissolve reservation land bases, terminate federal recognition of tribes. For tens of thousands of Lakota, Anishinaabe, and other nations' families, relocation meant one specific thing: leaving the land. And leaving the land meant leaving the gardens. Three Sisters Gardens are not portable. You cannot carry a polyculture system in a suitcase to a studio apartment in Chicago or Denver. The knowledge of which seeds to plant, how deep to mound the soil, when to watch for the first bean tendril climbing the cornstalk, that knowledge lives in the ground, in the season, in the hands that have done it before. Relocation severed that transmission for entire generations at once. Families arrived in cities. The garden stayed behind, untended. But the termination policy was not the beginning of this story. It was the acceleration of it. The federal boarding school system had been running since the 1860s. 526 institutions, more than the total number of Starbucks locations in the entire state of Minnesota, all dedicated in part to one goal. The United States Department of Interior confirmed this in its own 2022 report. Traditional food cultivation was explicitly prohibited in many of these facilities. Children from Haudenosaunee families in upstate New York, from Anishinaabe families in Minnesota, from Pueblo families in New Mexico, removed from home, prohibited from speaking their languages, prohibited from practicing their ceremonies, and prohibited from growing the food their grandmothers grew. 3 to 4 generations of Native families passed through those 526 schools between the 1860s and the 1970s. 3 to 4 generations without hands, in Three Sisters soil. That is not an accident. That is a policy. Now consider what replaced those gardens. In 1965, federal commodity food programs expanded across approximately 574 federally recognized tribal territories. 574 more distinct sovereign nations than there are countries in the entire European Union. Each of those nations had its own food traditions, its own seed varieties, its own relationship to the land. What they received instead was uniform: white flour, lard, canned goods, processed cheese, cane sugar. The nutritional inversion was total. Those crops, corn, beans, and squash, grown together, form a complete protein system, a fiber system, a vitamin system, developed over 4,000 years for exactly the bodies and climates of this continent. USDA records document that traditional Three Sisters polyculture can yield approximately 20,000 pounds of food per acre in combined harvest, exceeding monoculture corn yields in comparable low-input systems. That is roughly the weight of 2 adult African elephants' worth of food from a single acre. That is the system that was replaced with a cardboard box of commodity cheese. The consequences were not subtle, and they were not slow. Diabetes rates in Native communities that had eaten Three Sisters crops and wild game for millennia, He began climbing in the 1960s and have not stopped. The Commodity Food Program did not cause this in isolation, but it accelerated a nutritional collapse that was already being engineered by policy. Now here is the part that the food history books almost never tell you. Fry bread, the food most Americans associate with Native American cuisine, the food sold at powwows, the food on restaurant menus, labeled traditional, is not traditional. Fry bread was born in 1864 when the United States Army forcibly relocated Dene Navajo families to Bosque Redondo in New Mexico. The rations issued to those displaced families contained white flour, lard, salt, and sugar foods the Dene had never eaten, adapted into the only recipe those ingredients could make. Fry bread is the taste of forced removal. It is the recipe of land theft. Confusing fry bread with traditional indigenous food is not a minor error. It is mistaking the wound for the person. Sean Sherman has said this plainly. Our food has always been here, it just wasn't being honored. The wound became the identity. That was also a policy outcome. But here is what the policy did not account for. Seeds do not need institutions to survive. While boarding schools banned traditional cultivation and relocation programs, dismantled reservation gardens, something else was happening in the margins of official history. Seed keepers, many of them women in Haudenosaunee nations, including the Onondaga Nation, maintained heirloom Three Sisters seed stocks through the entire boarding school era. Not through institutions, through families, through women passing small paper envelopes and cloth pouches across kitchen tables when no one official was watching. The Onondaga seed keepers kept varieties alive that had no other custodians. Blue corn, Mohawk pole beans, Seneca squash, varieties that existed nowhere else on earth. They kept them because they understood something the policy designers did not. Food is not a product. Food is a relationship, and you cannot legislate a relationship out of existence. But that knowledge, while preserved at the seed level, was still being severed at the kitchen level, at the community level, at the transmission level. The seeds survived, but fewer and fewer people knew what to do with them. Which brings us to 1992, and a woman in Minnesota who decided that was unacceptable. Winona LaDuke is Anishinaabe, a member of the Ojibwe Nation, and in 1992, she did something that looked modest from the outside. She co-founded the White Earth Land Recovery Project on the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. The stated goal included restoring traditional Anishinaabe food systems, wild rice, maple sugar, and Three Sisters gardens. This was not nostalgia. LaDuke was explicit about that. This was sovereignty, food sovereignty. The argument that a nation controls its future only if it controls what it eats. The White Earth Land Recovery Project was not a museum project. It was not a cultural preservation grant. It was a political act. If a federal commodity program can undermine a nation's food independence in one generation, then rebuilding that food system is as political as negotiating a treaty. More political, in some ways, because you do not need federal approval to plant a garden. LaDuke's work in Minnesota created an institutional anchor for something that was already happening in fragments across the country. Indigenous farmers, seed keepers, and community organizers in the 1990s were independently rebuilding connections to traditional food systems in over a dozen states. They were working largely without mainstream recognition, largely without funding, and largely without the food media paying any attention. The food media in the 1990s was very interested in French technique, in California cuisine, in the farm-to-table movement among white chefs in converted warehouse restaurants. The most sophisticated agricultural system ever developed in North America was not on its radar. 4,000 years of accumulated plant knowledge, 0 food magazine covers. Meanwhile, in South Dakota, a boy was growing up on the Pine Ridge Reservation, eating what the federal government provided. Pine Ridge sits within the American Indian and Alaska Native poverty range of 22 to 24%, a rate that has persisted for decades. Sean Sherman grew up eating commodity rations, canned goods, processed cheese, the nutritional legacy of the same policy that had been running since 1865. He would later write about this in his cookbook, The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2017. He did not grow up learning Three Sisters cultivation from a grandmother in a garden. He grew up learning it later, the hard way, from books, from elders willing to teach, from his own determination to understand what had been taken. That gap between what should have been transmitted and what actually was is the wound that drives everything that comes after. In 2009, Sherman was working in Minneapolis restaurant kitchens. He had professional culinary training. He had skills. He had a career in the mainstream food industry, and he began asking a question that the mainstream food industry had no framework for. What did people eat here, on this specific land, before contact? Not as a thought experiment, as a culinary foundation. What he found, when he started researching, was both difficult and remarkable. Difficult because the knowledge had been so thoroughly disrupted that reconstructing it required archaeological sources, ethnobotanical records, and conversations with elders who held fragments of what had been nearly lost. Remarkable because what survived in seeds, in oral histories, in the institutional memory of nations that had refused to fully let go, was enough. The Three Sisters system that Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Pueblo nations had developed over 4,000 years was documentable, reproducible, delicious. Sherman discovered that the corn varieties maintained by Haudenosaunee seed keepers through the boarding school era had flavor profiles that no commercial corn could replicate. Sweet and starchy and mineral simultaneously, a faint smokiness even before roasting, the taste of a specific soil type, a specific rainfall pattern, a specific relationship between plant and place. He also found Teperi beans, a drought-adapted bean grown by Tohono O'odham and other southwestern nations, with a dense, earthy flavor and a protein content that outperforms most commercial bean varieties. And he found squash varieties with a sweetness and a color orange deepening to red at the edges that commercial butternut squash does not approach. These were not heritage curiosities. These were superior ingredients that had been replaced by inferior ones through the force of federal policy. By 2017, Sherman and his business partner Dana Vanass had founded the Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis. The mission was direct: train native chefs from across the 574 federally recognized tribes in pre-contact indigenous cooking, with the Three Sisters crops as the nutritional and culinary foundation. 574 tribes, more sovereign nations than there are countries in the European Union, each with distinct food traditions. The Indigenous Food Lab was not trying to flatten those distinctions into one native food. It was building a professional infrastructure that individual tribal food traditions could plug into, a training center where a Dene chef and an Anishinaabe chef and a Lakota chef could all work from their own traditions using a shared professional framework. Brian Yazzie Dene, known as Yazzie the Chef, became one of the figures who exemplified exactly this approach. Yazzie's work at the Indigenous Food Lab incorporated specifically Dene traditional corn varieties, distinct from Haudenosaunee Three Sisters traditions, into contemporary culinary education. This distinction matters enormously. The Three Sisters framework is not one monolithic tradition. Haudenosaunee corn varieties are not Dene corn varieties. Anishinaabe growing practices are not Pueblo growing practices. What connects them is the political fact of their shared targeting and the political act of their reclamation. Different seeds, same enemy, same refusal. On the West Coast, another refusal was taking shape. Crystal Wapepa, Kickapoo Nation, opened Wapepa's Kitchen in Oakland, California in 2021, one of the first brick-and-mortar indigenous restaurants on the West Coast. Wapepa sources Three Sisters crops from indigenous and local farms, building a menu that is simultaneously a business and an argument. In 2023, she was named a James Beard Award semi-finalist for Best Chef California, the first indigenous chef to reach that recognition at the regional level in the award's history. Oakland, Minneapolis, the White Earth Reservation, the Indigenous Food Lab. These are not separate stories. They are the same story running in parallel, the story of a food system refusing to stay erased. And the most revealing part of this story is still ahead. A food system that 526 schools and 60 years of commodity programs tried to dismantle, has been quietly rebuilding for 30 years. The seeds survived, the seed keepers survived, the chefs are trained and ready. The question now is not whether this food can be saved. It already was saved. The question is whether the country that tried to destroy it will acknowledge what it is looking at. July 4, 2021. Minneapolis, Minnesota. The date is not accidental. Sean Sherman chose Independence Day deliberately, and if you understand the history we have just walked through, you understand exactly why. The restaurant opens inside a restored building on the west bank of the Mississippi River, overlooking St. Anthony Falls. The Dakota people called this place Owamni, the swirling waters, the Great Falls, a site of spiritual and practical significance for thousands of years before a city was built around it. The restaurant is named Owamni. On the menu, roasted hominy corn, with a char and a mineral sweetness no commercial corn produces. Teperi beans, drought-grown, dense, earthy, the flavor of soil that has never been broken by commodity agriculture. Roasted squash with a color like late October afternoon light. Sweet in a way that builds slowly and stays. Every ingredient on that menu is a political statement dressed as dinner. No beef, because cattle were brought by Europeans and became the foundation of plains agriculture that displaced bison and the nations that followed bison. No wheat, because wheat flour was the commodity ration. Because wheat flour became fry bread. Because fry bread became the wound that was mistaken for the tradition. No dairy, because dairy production was introduced post-contact and became, through the commodity program, the government cheese that replaced the garden. The absence on that menu is as loud as the presence. The menu is an argument. Every empty line is evidence. Within its first full year, Owamni grossed approximately $4 million. $4 million is roughly the annual revenue of a mid-size, independently owned urban restaurant operating at high capacity. This was not a novelty restaurant with a niche audience. This was a commercially viable, critically acclaimed, fully operational business. Built on corn, beans, and squash. Built on seeds that Onondaga women passed through family networks while 526 schools operated. Built on knowledge that Sean Sherman had to reconstruct from ethnobotanical records because the commodity food program interrupted its natural transmission. In June 2022, Sherman stood at the James Beard Awards ceremony in Chicago. He was Oglala Lakota. He grew up on Pine Ridge, eating commodity rations. He accepted the James Beard Foundation Award for Best New Restaurant, the first Indigenous restaurant to win that category in the award's approximately 30-year history. Now consider the scale of what that moment represents. 7.4 million people in the United States carry American Indian and Alaska Native ancestry, roughly the population of the state of Washington. The poverty rate in American Indian and Alaska Native communities runs between 22 and 24%, a rate documented across decades of federal data. That poverty rate is not coincidental. It is the downstream consequence of the same policy pipeline we have traced: boarding schools, termination, relocation, commodity food dependency. The Indigenous Food Sovereignty movement, anchored by the Indigenous Food Lab, represented commercially by Owamni and Wapepa's Kitchen, and Brian Yazzi's institutional work, explicitly targets that connection. The argument is direct. If commodity food dependency is a policy outcome, then food sovereignty is a policy reversal. If diabetes and food insecurity in Native communities were accelerated by replacing Three Sisters crops with government rations, then restoring Three Sisters crops is a public health intervention. This is not metaphor. Clinical and public health researchers have documented the relationship between traditional indigenous diets and reduced metabolic disease rates in Native communities. The Three Sisters planting system is not a heritage decoration on a restaurant menu. It is a functional, nutritional architecture with 4,000 years of refinement behind it. Think of it as the original crop rotation software written 4,000 years before USDA agronomists started charging for the same logic. American industrial agriculture spent approximately 200 years developing a high-input monoculture system that is less efficient, less nutritionally diverse, and more environmentally costly than the system it displaced. Let that cost accounting sit with you. In 2024 and 2025, the movement is not slowing. The Indigenous Food Lab continues training Native chefs from across the 574 federally recognized tribes. Crystal Wapapa continues sourcing Three Sisters crops from indigenous farms and building a customer base in the Bay Area that extends well beyond Native communities. Brian Yazzie continues bringing specifically Dene traditional corn into institutional settings, universities, hospitals, community centers, spaces where food policy gets made at scale. And Sean Sherman continues serving roasted Owamni corn at Owamni to diners who may or may not know they are eating the endpoint of a 150-year argument. The argument that a food system once called primitive has outlasted every institution designed to erase it. The argument that seed keepers with no federal budget and no institutional backing can preserve 4,000 years of agricultural knowledge through a boarding school era that a government funded at scale. The argument that a Lakota man who grew up on commodity rations can build a $4 million restaurant on the food that commodity system replaced. None of this happened automatically. None of it happened because the system eventually did the right thing. It happened because specific people with specific names made specific choices to refuse. Winona LaDuke, in 1992, planting a political garden on White Earth land. Onondaga seed keepers, unnamed in the official record, passing corn varieties through family networks while boarding schools operated. Sean Sherman, in 2009, in a Minneapolis restaurant kitchen, deciding to find out what the food of his ancestors actually tasted like. Crystal Wapapa, in 2021, opening a brick-and-mortar restaurant in Oakland on the bet that indigenous food sovereignty was not a niche market. Brian Yazzie, in university dining halls and community centers, serving Dene corn to people who have never tasted it and watching them try to describe what they are experiencing. These are not feel-good stories added to the end of a dark history. They are the dark history's direct refutation. The refutation took 50 years. It is still in progress. If you eat at Owamni or Wapapa's Kitchen or any indigenous-owned restaurant using pre-contact food systems, you are participating in a food sovereignty economy, not just consuming a meal. If you source heirloom corn, tepary beans, or indigenous squash varieties from native-owned farms and seed companies, you are funding the agricultural infrastructure that the commodity system replaced. If you understand that fry bread is not a traditional food, but a recipe born from forced removal, and you say so when someone tells you otherwise, you are correcting a 160-year misidentification. And if you understand that the James Beard Award in 2022 was not a food trend milestone, but the measurable endpoint of a calculated, multi-generational attempt to erase a food system, and the equally considered refusal of that erasure by specific people with specific names, then you understand what American food actually is and where it actually came from. The Three Sisters are not a heritage curiosity. They are a living argument about who gets to define what American food means. The seeds survived 526 schools. They survived 60 years of commodity programs. They survived relocation and termination and the systematic severing of intergenerational agricultural knowledge. And in 2022, they stood on a stage in Chicago and accepted an award from an institution that had not known their name 30 years earlier. The food won, against every institution designed to make it lose. The Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis is actively accepting applications from Native chefs across all 574 federally recognized tribes. Owamni, by the Sioux Chef, is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the ancestral land of the Dakota people. The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, by Sean Sherman, is published by University of Minnesota Press. The seeds were never fully lost. Neither was the knowledge of what to do with them. If you source Three Sisters crops, heirloom corn, tepary beans, indigenous squash varieties, that is the oldest story in North American agriculture, and it is not finished yet. The Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis is actively accepting applications from Native chefs across all 574 federally recognized tribes. Owamni, by the Sioux Chef, is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the ancestral land of the Dakota people. The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen by Sean Sherman is published by University of Minnesota Press. The seeds were never fully lost, neither was the knowledge of what to do with them.